The classroom was a warm haven of music, bathed in the soft, golden glow of the afternoon sun filtering through tall, arched windows. Dust motes floated lazily in the light, making the air shimmer with a quiet serenity. Against one wall stood a grand piano, its polished surface reflecting slivers of sunlight, while stacks of sheet music teetered precariously on nearby shelves. Posters of classical composers adorned the walls, Beethoven, Chopin, and Mozart staring down as if silently observing every note played within the room. A faint scent of old books and varnished wood hung in the air, a combination that seemed to belong exclusively to spaces where music lived and breathed. The room had a comfortable clutter to it, a metronome ticking rhythmically on a side table, a few chairs scattered across the wooden floor, and a guitar resting casually in the corner, suggesting both practice and pause, discipline and creativity. Every detail of the room, the arrangement of instruments, the carefully positioned sheet stands, even the soft rug under the piano bench, seemed designed to make one focus entirely on music, yet with an unspoken intimacy that drew attention inward to feelings and emotions as much as technique. The teacher, an older man in his mid-40s with a neatly trimmed beard and kind but piercing eyes, stood near the piano. His presence commanded attention not with authority, but with an unassuming confidence, the kind that made one feel simultaneously seen and guided. He wore a simple sweater over a collared shirt, sleeves rolled slightly, hinting at the practical, hands-on nature of his teaching. There was something almost magnetic in the way he moved, each gesture deliberate, each glance directed with precision, yet soft enough to make the room feel personal and unhurried. Across from him, a young woman sat on the piano bench, fingers poised above the ivory keys, her notebook open to a page of scribbled notes and musical symbols. She was attentive, yet there was a subtle tension in her posture, an awareness that every instruction, every adjustment of her hand, carried a weight beyond simple technique. She glanced at him, and his eyes met hers, not in a formal teacher-student gaze, but in one that lingered, loaded with quiet intensity. Each correction he offered, each piece of advice, felt directed not just at her hands or her musical ability, but at her entire presence in the room. The air was alive with potential. The moment she pressed a key and a soft note floated into the room, it felt like a shared secret, a conversation without words. Music was the medium, but the connection went deeper. Every lesson seemed to touch on emotions, vulnerabilities, and subtle energies that neither of them could fully articulate. The room, with its light, its instruments, and its hushed atmosphere, had become a world of its own, private, charged, and profoundly personal. Even before the first scale was played, the classroom itself felt alive, as if it were anticipating the intimacy of the lesson to come. Each sound, each glance, each movement seemed magnified in this space, making it more than a place of instruction. It was a stage for emotions too complex to name, a sanctuary where music and personal connection intertwined seamlessly. Keynote 2. Close interaction. Expanded 500 words. The lesson had progressed to a moment that felt both ordinary and charged with subtle intensity. The young woman sat on the piano bench, her posture careful but slightly tense, as the teacher leaned over her shoulder to guide her hands along the ivory keys. The warmth of his presence was immediate, close enough that she could feel the faint scent of his cologne, a mixture of cedar wood and something faintly floral, grounding yet stirring in its subtlety. He moved with deliberate patience, adjusting the angle of her wrist, the curve of her fingers, and the pressure of her touch. Each correction was gentle, yet the closeness of his body created a private, intimate bubble within the otherwise sunlit room. His hands hovered near hers before making contact, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the room held its breath. The simple act of placing her fingers correctly became more than instruction. It was a lesson in focus, in trust, and unspoken, in attention to every detail of her presence. Her awareness of him was heightened. She noticed the soft crease of concentration between his brows, the way his eyes lingered on hers whenever she faltered on a note, and the quiet cadence of his voice as he guided her. There was a rhythm in the interaction, almost like a duet, not of sound but of shared energy. Every adjustment of her hands carried weight, each small touch resonating deeper than the music itself. It was as if the act of playing had become inseparable from the feeling of being noticed, fully and undistractedly, by another person. The room seemed to shrink around them, the light from the windows turning warmer, shadows lengthening in a way that made the space feel enclosed yet safe. The metronome ticked steadily in the background, but the real rhythm was in the careful closeness of the teacher's guidance and the student's response. When his hand briefly brushed against hers, adjusting a finger, shifting her hand slightly. The contact was fleeting but electric, sending a ripple of awareness through her. Her mind momentarily faltered on the note she was about to play, not because she lacked skill, but because the simple nearness of him made the music feel like a personal language shared only between them. It wasn't inappropriate, but it was charged. Every gesture, every word, every subtle glance carried a depth that went beyond standard lessons. The ordinary practice of scales and chords became a vessel for tension, curiosity, and a quiet sense of discovery. The intimacy of instruction blurred the lines between music and emotion. The physical closeness of their hands mirrored the emotional closeness that seemed to grow imperceptibly with each passing minute. When she finally struck the right chord under his guidance, he stepped back just slightly, offering a small nod and a soft, approving smile. Yet the air still hummed with the residual tension of the moment, the memory of hands nearly touching, of eyes meeting with a depth neither had yet named. Music had been the bridge, but the connection, the personal, undeniable pull between teacher and student, was what lingered in the room long after the note faded. The afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long, golden rays across the wooden floor. In the corner of the room rested a well-worn acoustic guitar, its polished surface reflecting flecks of light. Today's lesson had shifted from the piano to the guitar, and the young woman felt a subtle mix of excitement and apprehension as she picked up the instrument. She had practiced on her own before, but under the guidance of her teacher, every movement felt scrutinized, not in a harsh way, but in a way that made her acutely aware of herself, of him, and of the tiny space between them. He stood behind her, his presence close but not overbearing. His hands moved to adjust her posture, the placement of her fingers on the frets, and the angle at which she held the guitar. Each adjustment was meticulous, almost tender, and she felt an unusual awareness of how near he was. The warmth of his body behind her, combined with the subtle scent of his cologne, made the air feel charged in a way that was difficult to ignore. Every brush of his hands, though fleeting, sent a ripple of heightened attention through her, making her fingers tremble slightly on the strings. He spoke softly, his voice measured, giving instructions that were both technical and oddly intimate. Relax your thumb here, curve your fingers just slightly, feel the vibration in your fingertips. His words, though simple, seemed to carry double meaning in the closeness of the moment. She could sense the way he watched her, not just as a student struggling to hit the right chord, but as someone he was guiding carefully, almost protectively, through a shared experience. The lesson became more than practice. It became a subtle dance of proximity and awareness, each note a bridge between instruction and connection. Her hands moved under his guidance, and occasionally, their fingers brushed as he corrected her positioning. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but each time it happened, it sent a quiet shiver through her, making it impossible to focus solely on the notes. She realized that every movement, every small gesture, every glance carried an intensity far beyond the mechanics of playing the guitar. The room seemed to shrink, enclosing them in a private bubble where sound and emotion were intertwined. As she strummed the first proper chord correctly, he leaned slightly closer, his expression softening with encouragement. The approval was unmistakable, but what lingered longer was the unspoken tension of shared space. Even the simplest chord seemed amplified, resonating with layers of meaning she wasn't entirely prepared to confront. The music became a language of its own, speaking in subtle cues, in fleeting touches, in lingering eye contact, in the warmth of proximity. By the end of the session, the chord progression they practiced felt like more than music. It was an experience that left her acutely aware of the personal nature of their interactions. The guitar rested between them, a tangible reminder of the intimacy of learning, and she realized that this was what made each lesson feel so uniquely personal. Every note, every gesture, and every look carried a weight that went far beyond instruction. The afternoon light had softened into a warm amber, spilling across the classroom and highlighting the texture of the wooden floors. On the piano bench between them lay a stack of sheet music, slightly worn at the edges, filled with handwritten notes and markings. Today's lesson revolved around reading and interpreting these sheets, a seemingly simple task that, under his guidance, became far more intricate and intimate. She sat close to the piano, eyes scanning the musical notes, while he leaned in just behind her, his presence close enough that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. The distance between them was minimal, a subtle space charged with an unspoken awareness. He gently pointed to a note, guiding her hand along the page, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. Each accidental touch sent a shiver of consciousness through her, making the notes on the page blur slightly, as though the music itself had become alive with tension. His voice was soft, instructive, yet carried a rhythm that seemed to resonate with more than just the music. Here, hold the pause, let the note linger, feel it in your chest. The guidance was technical, but the way he leaned in, watching her reactions, gave every instruction a personal depth. She noticed the small details, the slight crease in his brow as he considered her technique, the way his eyes softened whenever she struggled, the subtle encouragement hidden in the almost imperceptible nods of approval. It was more than a lesson. It was a careful calibration of attention and emotion, delivered in proximity that made every page of music feel intensely private. As she followed his instructions, her fingers tracing the notes, he leaned slightly closer again, explaining a tricky passage. Their shoulders nearly touched, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though the music was not just on the page, but vibrating between them, a shared language that went beyond sound. Each instruction carried weight, not just in technical terms, but emotionally, as if each note represented a connection that couldn't be spoken aloud. The rhythm of their interaction was delicate, his patience guiding her, her focus anchored by his presence, creating a tension that was invisible but undeniable. He adjusted her posture subtly, moving her hand over the keys as she read the sheet music aloud. The proximity of his hand, the gentle guidance, the shared focus on the notes, it all combined to make the ordinary act of reading music feel intensely personal. Her heart rate quickened slightly, though the room remained quiet save for the soft scratch of pencil markings and the occasional note from the piano. Even a metronome, ticking steadily in the background, seemed to slow, as though it too recognized the intimacy of the moment. By the end of the session, the sheet music had transformed from a simple instructional tool into a conduit of connection. Every note, every mark, every brush of hands carried significance beyond music. The young woman closed the book slowly, aware that the lesson had been about more than technical skill. It had been about closeness, awareness, and the subtle interplay of presence. In that quiet, amber-lit classroom, the sheet music became a silent witness to a personal, delicate bond, one that lingered long after the final note had faded. The afternoon had deepened into a gentle, golden haze that filtered softly through the tall windows of the music room. Today's lesson was on the violin, and the young woman approached the instrument with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. The violin, delicate and polished, rested against her shoulder, its wooden body warm and resonant under her touch. Across from her stood her teacher, a calm presence, his eyes focused intently on her every movement, his posture relaxed yet commanding in a way that subtly drew her attention and trust. He moved closer to adjust her hold, his hand briefly resting near hers on the bow, guiding her fingers to the correct positions. The contact was fleeting but significant, an unspoken communication that was almost electric in its intimacy. She could feel the warmth of his hand near hers, the subtle pressure as he corrected her grip, and the gentle way he encouraged her to relax her shoulders. Each adjustment seemed small, almost mundane in technique, but the proximity and the focused attention turned the lesson into something deeply personal. Relax your arm, let the bow flow naturally. Feel the resonance in the strings, he instructed softly. His voice was calm, almost hypnotic, yet carried a depth that made her pulse quicken slightly. She noticed the meticulous care with which he observed her posture, the slight tilt of her chin, the tension in her wrist, all subtle cues that informed his guidance. The lesson was not merely about mastering the notes. It was about aligning herself fully with the music, with him, and with the unspoken connection that seemed to exist between them. As she drew the bow across the strings, he leaned slightly closer, adjusting her hand again, guiding her to feel the vibration and weight of each note. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with quiet intensity. Each motion of the bow, each careful placement of fingers on the strings, felt amplified, charged with a tension that was both thrilling and unnerving. The soft sound of the violin filled the room, but it was the silent, almost magnetic attention between teacher and student that dominated the moment. There was a delicate rhythm to their interaction. Instruction, adjustment, correction, repetition. Yet every gesture carried weight, and every glance seemed to linger longer than necessary. The young woman became acutely aware of the closeness, the personal attention, and the subtle intimacy of a lesson. Her concentration on the music was interwoven with the heightened awareness of his presence. The violin became a bridge between technical mastery and emotional connection. By the end of the session, the room was filled with soft vibrations, the echo of careful notes lingering in the air. The young woman lowered the violin slowly, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and lingering tension. The lesson had been about music, but it had also been about the closeness, trust, and unspoken understanding that had quietly developed between them. Each note played had carried more than melody. It carried connection, subtle emotion, and the unmistakable feeling that every lesson was, in its own way, intensely personal. The music room's walls had been replaced by open air, and the afternoon sun bathed the garden in a warm, golden light. Today's lesson was unconventional, an outdoor session meant to inspire creativity, but for the young woman, it carried an added layer of intimacy. The garden was a quiet sanctuary, filled with flowering plants, neatly trimmed hedges, and the soft hum of bees moving from blossom to blossom. Sunlight danced across the grass, casting gentle patterns that moved with the breeze, making the space feel alive and yet deeply private. He positioned a small wooden bench under the shade of a flowering tree, where dappled sunlight filtered through the leaves. A portable piano had been set nearby, and beside it rested an acoustic guitar. The arrangement of the instruments seemed casual, yet intentional, creating a private world where music and the natural beauty of the garden intertwined seamlessly. As she approached, her eyes caught his calm smile, and a flutter of nervous anticipation rose in her chest. The outdoor setting magnified the lesson's intimacy, the open space paradoxically making every glance, every gesture, feel more personal. He began by playing a soft melody on the piano, the notes drifting over the garden like a gentle breeze. She listened closely, feeling the vibrations of the music in the air and in her chest. Then he invited her to join him on the guitar, demonstrating a simple chord progression. As she strummed along, he moved close behind her to adjust her hand, the warmth of his presence palpable even in the open air. His hands guided her fingers with careful precision, brushing hers ever so slightly, each contact lingering just long enough to make her heart race. The garden seemed to hold its breath, the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds fading into the background. Every correction, every instruction was delivered softly, intentionally, yet loaded with a subtle intensity. He leaned in to show her a particular fingering, his shoulder brushing hers as he did so. The proximity was electrifying, and she found herself acutely aware of every movement, every note, and every nuance of his attention. The music became a conduit not just for skill, but for an unspoken connection that neither had acknowledged aloud. As they switched between piano and guitar, he encouraged her to listen, not just to the notes, but to the emotion within them, to the subtle pauses, and to the resonance carried by the natural surroundings. The sunlight warmed her skin, but it was the closeness of his attention, the quiet intensity of his focus on her playing, that left the deepest impression. The outdoor lesson blurred the line between instruction and personal connection, turning ordinary practice into an experience that was both intimate and unforgettable. By the end of the session, the garden had grown softer with shadows, the notes of the instruments lingering in the air. She felt a rare combination of exhilaration and vulnerability. The lesson had been about music, technique, and listening, but more than that, it had been about presence, subtle intimacy, and the quiet ways in which connection could flourish in an unexpected setting. The garden was no longer just a place for learning. It had become a world where every glance, every touch, and every note carried profound meaning, leaving a lasting imprint on her heart. The room was quiet, almost reverent, except for the faint hum of the city beyond the tall windows. The young woman sat alone at the grand piano, her fingers hovering above the keys, hesitating for a moment before plunging into the melody she had been practicing under his guidance. This was her solo moment, but his presence, though not physically in the room, was felt in every note, in every breath, and the subtle memory of his touch guiding her hands in previous lessons. The soft lighting from the afternoon sun highlighted the polished surface of the piano, casting reflections that danced along the wooden floor. Her music notebook lay open nearby, marked with his corrections and small notes, a tangible reminder of the close, personal attention that had shaped her playing. As she began to play, each note resonated not only through the instrument, but through her awareness of him. The lessons, the gentle touches, the way he had leaned over her hands, guiding her through every intricate movement. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, each chord and scale echoing the rhythm of their shared time in the classroom. She could almost feel him behind her, correcting a misplaced finger, adjusting her wrist, whispering encouragement in that calm, measured tone that had become so familiar. The memory of his closeness, the warmth of his hands near hers, the subtle brush of skin when he adjusted her position, added layers of emotion to the music she was producing. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It had become a vessel carrying the intimacy of their lessons. Every pause in the music felt significant. Every sustained note weighted with both the technical precision he demanded and the quiet emotional intensity that had grown between them. She noticed how much the solo practice differed from playing in his direct presence. Alone, she could focus entirely on the melody, yet the echo of him lingered, his instructions, his gaze, the subtle closeness that had made each lesson feel personal. The interplay between memory and music created a tension that was both exhilarating and slightly unnerving. As she continued, she found herself experimenting with the dynamics of the piece, adding gentle flourishes and lingering on notes that had previously been difficult. It was as though his guidance had unlocked a new awareness, not just of the music, but of her own emotional expression through it. Each note became infused with the quiet energy of their connection, the lesson shaping not only her skill, but her very way of feeling and interpreting sound. When she finally finished, the last note hanging softly in the air, she remained seated, her fingers hovering above the keys, absorbing the weight of the practice. The room was silent except for the fading resonance of the piano, yet the presence of her teacher, his patience, his closeness, his subtle, guiding touch, still filled the space. It was clear that the music she played was more than just technical mastery. It was a reflection of the deeply personal nature of their lessons, a silent testament to the connection that had grown between teacher and student in ways she could feel but could not yet name.